Welcome everybody to our webinar today. This webinar will focus on best practices for officer elections. As we begin, I acknowledge and honor the original inhabitants of our various regions. SACNAS is based in California, which is currently home to nearly 200 tribal nations. Land acknowledgements serve as a first step towards reconciliation because they acknowledge that we live and work on unceded indigenous land. At the same time, on we at the same time, land acknowledgements honor the rich culture of indigenous people and remind us that the land is sacred. Let me take a moment to honor the ancestral grounds that we are collectively gathered upon and support the resilience and strength that all indigenous people have shown worldwide. I acknowledge that the land I currently work on is the traditionally unceded territory of the Adena, Hopewell, Miami, Shawnee, and Osage people that inhabited Ohio before the founding of the state and that continue to live on these lands. Thank you. So my name is Eric Curiel. I'm the National Chapters Manager here at SACNAS. And in this webinar, we'll cover best practices for preparing and executing your chapter's officer elections. That includes the nomination process, actual voting for the elections, some information on onboarding new officers, and then we'll have some time for Q&A at the end as well. With that being said, I encourage you to submit your questions on the chat. Please be mindful, polite, and respectful, and also feel free to share your chapter name or the institution that you're from. So I'll begin with the nomination process. So a member may nominate themselves or another member for upcoming officer elections. We highly recommend that your nominees be active members in your chapter, and that members may be nominated for multiple positions. However, they can only fill one position with the exception of the national liaison. So for example, you could have typically it's the president that can sometimes also serve as national liaison, or national liaison may just be its separate person that gets that position. Let's see. And then we highly encourage you to allow enough time to have these nominations, right? So we highly encourage, so the timing of this webinar was really based on kind of the time that we're on now. So we highly encourage you, if you haven't already started nominations, to hopefully start them soon so that you have at least 1 month of nominations before you actually hold your elections. This will allow your nominees enough time to actually have the opportunity to campaign for themselves. The example I provide here will be talking about having the nomination in March to have your, I think I have it on my next slide here. Your elections typically be not at the end of the academic year. So with the example I was providing is if you hold your nominations now, they'll give you all of March to do your nominations and then have elections in April. The key thing for that is so that there's a transition period between your current officers and your new cohort of officers. And that really just helps with the sustainability of your chapter, which can be a word I use a lot in this webinar. Officer terms are 1 year. However, members can be re-elected multiple times for concurrent years. But they do have to be actually elected for those multiple years. You can't just assume that if I got elected 1 year that I'm just going to hold my position for multiple years. So for the voting itself, all of your active members should be eligible to vote, and voting should be conducted by a seeker ballot. That ballot should be prepared by your secretary, depending on all the nominees that that you have for all of your positions. The secretary should be the one that's responsible for creating that ballot. And I also wanted to mention that typically, I think in the past, a lot of chapters did voting in person, but just kind of due to the circumstances that we're in now, you're definitely able to now have that flexibility, right? So that you can do it in person if it's appropriate for your chapter, but you can also hold it virtually. And I think that's a really great idea to do moving forward. It also allows the opportunity for more members to make sure that they get their voice heard in these chapter elections in case you did do them in person and they were not available during that set time or date that you typically were planning. Virtual, I think, is provide you more flexibility essentially so that more of your members have their voices heard. So deciding the new officers. So once you gather all of your votes in, the majority vote decides new officers. If there's not a majority vote, so for example, if you have 3 or more persons being nominated for a particular position and there's not a clear majority, then you would do it so that the top 2 candidates do a runoff election. I also want to mention that if somebody was nominated for multiple positions and they were elected for multiple positions, again, with that exception of the national liaison position, they can only fill one position, so they will have to concede one of the other positions, again, if it's not the national liaison position. So before I move on to onboarding, I did want to mention kind of going back to the nomination process. One key tip that I would provide is trying to, when you're having the nomination process, is trying to have it so that you kind of have a diversity of members as far as their kind of expected graduation year goes. So what you really want to do is avoid essentially being that scenario where like all of the people who are elected in 1 year are not going to essentially graduate the same year and then be gone, because then that's going to create a scenario where your new officers for that following year won't really have that experience. So kind of just keep that in mind when you're nominating people for new positions, is kind of just trying to have that some people having experience and be able to retain it to, again, help with that sustainability of chapters moving forward. So yeah, that was a long-winded thing to basically say, try to avoid having, for example, all seniors being elected or not elected, but even before that in the nomination process. So now jumping back to onboarding officers, this is a really essential process. Because again, you don't want your new officers to really have to start from zero. You want to provide that time for them to get their feet wet essentially, and learn from the current officers. So after they're elected, you should be able to provide the new officers the expectations of their specific roles. So what I recommend is having one-on-one meeting between the current and newly elected officers for each, and basically reviewing the specific responsibilities for each of those roles, right? So like your current president should be meeting with the newly elected president to go over their responsibilities. The treasurer should do the same thing with the current treasurer, with the newly elected treasurer, and so forth with all of the positions that you have. That should typically happen relatively soon after the elections. And then we also really recommend doing a group retreat with all of the officers, the current and new officers. Again, that really helps kind of build that team. Typically, some chapters I know do that in the springtime before the end of the academic year. Others typically wait until the summertime to do like a group retreat. So if you do kind of wait till the summertime to do the group retreat, I still recommend that you do those one-on-one meetings before the academic year, because again, you want to make sure that the newly elected officers are prepared so that they can effectively take charge once they're responsible. Another thing is, as you're going through those responsibilities, is also making sure that you share with the new officers basically access to any of the appropriate platforms, or just essentially any of the accounts that your chapter currently manages. Um, that can include access to your chapter's email account, social media accounts. Make sure to do introductions to appropriate staff on campus. So, for example, if the treasurer works closely with somebody on campus that manages your budget, making sure to introduce that new treasurer with that staff person to be familiar, and again, let them be able to be set up to be successful once they start off by themselves. Any chapter documents, history that you have for the chapter is going to be super helpful for the new officers. That can include essentially like your planning material that you had for the previous year, any meeting notes, any evaluations or reports that you did. Again, all of this information will really help the new officers be able to plan and have something to work off of. Essentially, what you want them to do is really just improve on the work that you've already done. You don't necessarily want them to start from scratch or start at zero, right? Because then they're going to have to spend a lot of time and energy just figuring out what they want to do. And that's really what you want to avoid. And I think the last major thing that I have on here is really providing new officers the opportunity to complete tasks and basically with the guidance of the current officers. So again, this is kind of the main reason why we recommend having your elections before the end of the academic year, so that you have enough time to have the opportunity to do this, right? So a common thing is just having your new officers organize a chapter meeting or event towards the end of the year. This will be a great opportunity for those new officers to kind of know what that working relationship is going to be like with their new officers. It's going to provide them the opportunity to ask questions that they didn't know they had before actually organizing an event or meeting with their new officers. And this will also provide the current officers the opportunity to provide constructive feedback, which is going to be really important. And again, that's the main reason why we want to have chapters do their elections before the academic year, so that you have that transition period to really try to maintain that sustainability. With that being said, that's the end of my formal presentation. I really want to make sure that we have enough time for any questions. So again, go ahead and submit any questions that you have on the chat. And can stop sharing from here. See if there's anything. I think one question that I did see before we started here, somebody asked if they recommend having new members run for positions. Again, I would recommend trying to have active current members run for the positions, just because you essentially want somebody who is already familiar with your chapter to be the ones that are kind of more in those leadership positions. So I'm not going to give you a hard no, but I do recommend that. I think if it's a person that's a general member who's actively been going to your meeting and is familiar with the process, I think they would make the ideal candidates. Another thing I also wanted to mention that I forgot in that presentation is that current officers can also run for different positions. And that can really help create kind of a culture of sustainability and kind of retaining some of that knowledge from year to year, right? So that you can have some officers that already do have experience, particularly in the officer positions, mixed in with other members that have been general members, but it's their first time being in a leadership position. So that's definitely possible. As I mentioned, they just have to rerun for election or nomination, either for that same position or any other position. I don't think I see any other questions. Okay, so in that case, I'll jump back to the slides here. Share screen, and then I'll go over a few other slides here that I have before we finish here. So next steps. Highly encourage you to check out our webinar series on sacnas.org/webinars. For chapters, we're doing a series of webinars to help with the sustainability of your chapters. Before this, we did marketing your SACNAS chapter. And then in the next few months, we're going to have a webinar on maintaining your chapter documents and records, kind of best practices on that. We'll be talking about developing a timeline or an agenda for your chapters with activities based on membership feedback. We'll talk about best practices for membership recruitment, and then we'll also talk about chapter budget. So those are all going to be future webinars that we'll be doing as part of this series later down in the year. And I think those should soon be available. The date should be listed on the website soon so that you can kind of start planning for those. I do ask you to do the webinar survey at the end of this. Again, that really helps us with improving our programming for future webinars. And finally, if you enjoyed today's webinar, you can help us produce more webinars like this by making a donation in any amount at sacnas.org. Your donation will go towards more virtual programming like this, as well as year-round programming like chapters and leaderships. Please visit sacnas.org/donate to make your donations and find other ways to support us. Thank you very much.